A very good morning. Good to have you with us. An independent report on the chaotic scenes at last year's Champions League final between Liverpool and Real Madrid says it was European football's governing body, UEFA, and the French authorities who were responsible for what it says almost turned into a mass fatality catastrophe. Thousands of Liverpool fans were tear-gassed, which caused crushing outside of the Stade de France ahead of the match. At the time, the behaviour of those supporters was under question. But the document, commissioned by UEFA itself and seen first by Sky News, has found that the French authorities tried to deflect responsibility onto English fans following false claims that many of them had fake tickets. Our sports correspondent Rob Harris has the story.
It was the biggest night of the European football season that almost led to a disaster, with Liverpool fans forced to endure crushing and congestion. They were initially falsely blamed for the 2022 Champions League final chaos. But in a review first revealed by Sky News, safety failings and misleading statements by authorities are now clear. UEFA, who commissioned the report, were found to bear primary responsibility for the failure as the ultimate event organisers. But the police and French Football Federation are also found culpable for not protecting the public sufficiently.
It's here where the failings trying to control the crowds were most apparent. A bottleneck formed of Liverpool fans. And what the review found is there should have been a plan B to deal with situations as they developed. But there were no contingencies to ensure that police and stewards could be redeployed to deal with issues as they developed.
It's been revealed there was no venue risk assessment.
These were the main access points for Liverpool fans, but the turnstiles were closed for parts of the night as police struggled to deal with locals trying to climb over the fences to access the stadium. Tear gas and pepper spray was used too proactively, the review finds, and that police were wrong to deploy tear gas and pepper spray in this scenario. It led to blameless Liverpool fans suffering.
It was an absolute mess, no organisation, total people worried, without the skin. And when the announcement come over on the screen, we were quite lucky we got in before it got really bad. And we had phone calls from home, because it's seen on the telly, just blaming us from the start. And the first thing you think of is what's happened in the past.
The review uncovered a policing operation wrongly based on Liverpool fans being a threat. UEFA was found to have marginalised its safety and security unit. There was a lack of contingencies, and overall communication between UEFA and French officials was poor.
I don't believe at all that the authorities have taken this seriously. They thought that they could get away with scapegoating Liverpool fans because it's worked in the past. And it's only because of the vigilance and the stoicism of fans that once again the truth has come out.
The Liverpool fans who were smeared in Paris have been exonerated, and UEFA have apologised. But how close fans came to losing their lives and the attempts to deflect blame will be hard to forget for those subjected to danger.
And Rob joins me now live from Paris. Good morning to you, Rob. Certainly, this report seems to lay the blame squarely at UEFA and French authorities. So understandably, a lot of anger from Liverpool fans over the false accusation initially.
Yeah, a lot of anger from those Liverpool fans who endured that night in Paris here last May at the Merseyside derby last night. They were telling us of how they feel vindicated to see this account now put out there to show actually it was the French authorities and UEFA responsible for a match that did start 37 minutes late in the end. Such was the disarray unfolding in the stadium behind me in the outer perimeters. And certainly from the French authorities, we haven't actually heard anything following the publication of this report. We were trying to make contact with them yesterday in the hours before we broke the news of the key findings of this investigation. There was a partial apology last year from the French Interior Minister, but certainly there are many questions this report raises about their conduct, the fact they asked UEFA on the night to remove references from their statement to locals causing trouble, trying to climb into the stadium. There were attacks on fans on the night, and the lack of connectivity between UEFA and the French police and government is certainly something highlighted in this report as a problem, and it will be a concern going forward. We are just months away from the Rugby Union World Cup starting here in September. There's also the Olympics here in 2024. The Stade de France, one of the venues for that. So France is at the centre of world sport over the next year. Very different events, of course, from a Champions League final. And actually, that's something also signified in the report as well. The fact the outdated plans that were being used by UEFA, basing their model on a different type of game. And still there will be questions today about those UEFA officials who are presiding over the night in their events division. One official in particular criticised for the truthfulness of the evidence he gave to the French Senate and how he seemed to claim to have a lack of knowledge of past instances at this stadium, past crowd challenges, past organisational challenges, and yet he claimed not to know about them despite seemingly actually being aware of them. So what is clear from this report is a far graver situation could have unfolded last year at the Stade de France. There could well have been deaths, the report makes clear, and certainly what will be sought now are assurances from the French authorities over how this could be prevented in future, and from UEFA how they will ensure there are better checks on stadiums they're using for their biggest games of the season.
Yeah, certainly all very important points you mentioned there, Rob, with the World Cup just a few months away. Good to see you. Thanks very much indeed. Now, just some breaking news to bring you. The ONS has just released lots of new data, including revealing just how many working days have been lost due to strike action in recent months. And our business correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan, is here now with all the details. Hi, Gurpreet. So numbers just in. How are they looking and what do they tell us about the state of the economy?
Yeah, there's a lot in this report, and I'm going to get to the strike data in a second because it is really important. But I'm going to start from the beginning because there's a lot in here, and the main message is that the jobs market is starting to weaken. Redundancies are up, vacancies are falling. The unemployment rate still stable at 3.7%, but we expect that those redundancies and vacancies figures will start filtering into the unemployment rate. In many ways, this tells us what we already know. Our economy is pretty weak. We're the only G7 economy that hasn't recovered to its pre-pandemic size, and we're heading for a recession. Now, that being said, 3.7% unemployment, it's still pretty low by historic standards. Our labour market is actually still pretty tight. We've got millions of people who are inactive. That means they're not even looking for work. They may have retired early. They may be too sick to work. And a smaller labour force increases competition for jobs, which puts pressure on wages. And policymakers are keeping a really close eye on this because when wages go up, that could fuel inflation. And at the moment, in the private sector, wages are rising by 7.3%. Still lower than inflation, which means living standards are falling, but uncomfortably high for the Bank of England. And all of this is leading to an almighty fallout, as we can see, in the form of strikes all over the country. And data out today shows that there were 843,000 days lost to strike action. That's working days lost to strike action in December alone. That's the highest since November 2011. And if we take a broader view and have a look at the data since June, 2.4 million days were lost to strike action. That's the highest annual figure since 1989. So despite policymakers' warnings about higher wages, which could fuel inflation, it's quite clear that people aren't willing to see their living standards decline.
Yeah, and certainly not that surprising, those strike figures there, given what we saw in December. Gurpreet, thanks so much. Also this morning, the United States has accused Beijing of running a high-altitude balloon programme, even though it says there is no indication yet that the three most recent objects it shot down were the same type of balloon used by Beijing and brought down 10 days ago. But tension between the two countries has increased, including a news conference last night at the White House.
We were able to determine that China has a high-altitude balloon program for intelligence collection that's connected to the People's Liberation Army. It was operating during the previous administration, but they did not detect it. We detected it. We tracked it. And we have been carefully studying it to learn as much as we can.
John Kirby speaking there at a press conference last night. Well, let's bring in our Asia correspondent, Helen Smith, who's standing by in Beijing for us. Hello to you, Helen. Certainly, it seems tensions between the US and China are increasing, and there's a very real concern that things could escalate.
Yeah, that's right. And in that press conference there that you heard from, actually the accusations being levelled by the Americans to China are not necessarily new ones. That accusation of this high-altitude balloon programme, or a fleet of balloons, as it was called last week, was made on Friday. But the Americans clearly keen to either keep the public informed or indeed perhaps keep up pressure on the Chinese. And there's no doubt at all that here in Beijing, authorities are really pretty angry about it. The Chinese, sticking absolutely resolutely to the line that the first balloon that was shot down by the Americans just over a week ago now, that's the only one that the Chinese have claimed is theirs, but say is a civilian craft. Absolutely resolutely sticking to that line that it was a civilian craft and that the American response to that was an overreaction. But the Americans also gave us some slightly new information yesterday. We found out that from that debris that's been collected from that first balloon, that amongst that was what they described as key electronics and key sensors, presumably used for intelligence gathering. Again, the Americans did say last week that they do have strong evidence now, they believe, to say that that balloon was a spy balloon, but just reiterating that point there. The mystery, as you say, continues over those three unidentified craft that were shot down over America and Canada over the weekend. Actually, the Americans nor the Canadians at the moment can say exactly what they are or where they've come from, and there's problems gathering some of those bits. But clearly a lot of tension over this, and the Chinese, for their part, as I said, not confirming or denying that any of those unidentified craft are theirs. In fact, even giving an indication that they're preparing to shoot down an object over its airspace. So really a messy situation. Hard to believe, really, that just over a week and a half ago, the US Secretary of State was due to visit Beijing. It feels a long way from that now.
Yeah, it certainly does. Helen Ann, good to see you. Thanks very much indeed. And we will have more on that story throughout the programme here on Sky News this morning. To other news now, and Buckingham Palace says Camilla, the Queen Consort, has tested positive for COVID. The 75-year-old has cancelled her public engagements for a week after a positive test result. And we can bring in Sky's Becky Cottrell for more on this, who's outside Buckingham Palace this morning. Morning to you, Becky. Certainly the Queen Consort at 75 years old is in one of the higher risk categories. So a concern still for Camilla.
A concern, but the palace says she's in good spirits, that she's resting and is disappointed she's had to cancel events this week, and they've apologised to those who were due to attend. The first we'd heard of this was yesterday, when the palace said they were postponing Camilla's events and that she had a seasonal illness. It seems then a COVID test was done, they got a positive result, and it was later that we had the announcement that she had COVID-19. I think the wording in the statement from the palace, symptoms of a cold, would suggest that she isn't seriously ill. It's not the first time that Camilla has had COVID. She caught it at a similar time last year. She had to do the same thing, cancel her public engagements while she took time to recover. But we do understand that she and the King have had all of their jabs, including the booster, and we know how much vaccinations have helped with this virus. They've allowed us to kind of carry on with our lives. Previously, as you mentioned, there would have been a lot of concern, particularly about older people catching this virus. Camilla is 75. Doesn't mean to say people can't still get seriously ill with COVID, but hopefully with her jabs, with some rest, the Queen Consort will have a smooth recovery. Her catching COVID is also a reminder, not that many of us needed it, many of us do know people still getting COVID, but it is a reminder that this virus is still very much around and something that we are having to deal with. But we do understand that no other member of the royal household at the moment has caught COVID, and the King is set to continue with his public engagements later this week, although without the Queen Consort.
OK, Becky, for now, thanks very much. Still to come on the show this morning. In a few minutes, we'll get some reaction to the Champions League report with a Liverpool fan who was at the match that day, sports journalist Dan Austin. Shortly after, we'll hear about the challenges being faced by the children caught up in last week's earthquakes with UNICEF's Carmen Monclou. And then just after 8, I'll be joined by Labour's Shadow Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, Abina Apong Asari. Now, it's being reported this morning that Syria's President Assad will open more crossing points into his country to allow more aid to be sent to the survivors of the 2 earthquakes which destroyed parts of Turkey and Syria. The death toll has now reached more than 35,000, and many of the people who did survive are now struggling to live. Well, we can speak now to Sky's Cordelia Lynch, who's in the city of Adana in the south of the country. Morning to you, Cordelia. So it seems more aid will be arriving for Syria, but certainly it seems more help is needed desperately everywhere.
That's right, Sally. It's a desperate situation here in Turkey and even more so in Syria. The UN has welcomed the agreement from Assad that he will allow for 2 more crossing points to get in that vital aid. That follows a meeting between the UN humanitarian chief, Richard Griffiths, who was meeting with Assad in what he described as a positive and constructive meeting. The White Helmets, though, a key rescue group operating in the rebel-held northwest, have said that that gives Assad free political gain. It is, of course, a deeply febrile situation there. But Richard Griffiths said that the aid must get throughout Syria in those areas that need it. Now, I'm in Adana. This is an area that's normally a market, Sally. Now has 1,500 people that have been displaced because of the earthquake. Here they are still finding buildings that are structurally unsafe, and we have witnessed the devastation, the desperation that continues here. Yesterday we were in Antakya in the south, where we saw the last efforts being made, efforts trained on this one particular building, where they were able miraculously to rescue a mother and father. They were hoping that their 26-year-old son could make it through. We were there for 8 hours as they were using thermal equipment, sniffer dogs, as they are in pockets of Turkey here, despite the fact it is more than a week since the earthquake hit. Unfortunately, he in that instance did not make it through, and I think hope now is desperately fading. One of the things that I've been very conscious of is the mix here. You are seeing some areas where they've got a lot of heavy equipment and others that feel bereft of help, quite frankly. And at the core here is a conversation around the structural safety of the buildings. We were in Iskenderun. That was one area that was obliterated. It's a blitz-like image in that town. I spoke to one man who just made it out of his building. The one next to it completely obliterated. And you're hearing a lot of discussion of people saying that these were profiteering contractors who were trying to make money at the expense of safety. I think we'll hear more about that in the days to come.
Yeah, certainly something we've heard a lot of is that earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do. We appreciate your update, Cordelia. Thank you. Let's have a look at some of today's other headlines now. And 3 people have been killed after a shooting at Michigan State University, with the gunman reported to have died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Police say 5 people have also been taken to hospital, some in a life-threatening condition. Thousands of students will face disruption as university staff walk out later. More than 70,000 staff from the University and College Union are set to strike in a dispute over pay, pensions and conditions. It's the first of 3 consecutive days of action across 150 universities in the UK. Amazon workers have announced further strikes at one of the company's warehouses in a dispute over pay. The GMB union says more than 350 staff at the fulfilment centre in Coventry will walk out on dates throughout February and March. Last month, they became the first Amazon workers in the UK to strike. Now, New Zealand has declared a national state of emergency as the country continues to be battered by Cyclone Gabrielle. Well, Sky's Nicole Johnston is following the story from Sydney for us. Hello to you, Nicole. Now, New Zealand does not call these states of emergency very often. What's the situation?
Well, the situation does appear to be deteriorating. Some 225,000 people across the North Island of New Zealand are now without power. Only a few hours ago, that number was around 40,000. So officials are certainly concerned. As you said, they don't normally declare these states of emergency. The last time was during the COVID pandemic and the Christchurch earthquake. So they're really worried about rising floodwaters, damaged infrastructure, roads, bridges. Footage is coming out of people waiting on their rooftops to be rescued. The military's been called in, 200 personnel are trying to help with it. There is expected to be a weakening of this ex-tropical cyclone on Wednesday as it starts to move from the North Island to the South Island. But clearly New Zealand has a massive clean-up operation ahead of it. And this is the second mass flooding event they've had in the last 2 weeks.
Extraordinary period. Nicole, thanks so much. Now, NATO's chief has warned that Russia's new offensive in Ukraine has already begun as NATO defence ministers meet in Brussels. Our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, is outside NATO headquarters in Brussels for us this morning. Hello to you, Adam. What can we expect today? Do you think NATO defence ministers will be under pressure to offer more to Ukraine, given that this latest offensive seems to have already started?
Yeah, I think they will be. I think there is going to be pressure. The question is, what is that support going to look like? Jens Stoltenberg has already said that he recognises that there is growing pressure to supply fighter jets to Ukraine. I think that everyone here, all the defence ministers meeting here, will probably be reluctant to take that big step because, frankly, supplying fighter jets, A, looks like an escalation, B, logistically it's very complicated, and C, there are questions about just how helpful that is, bearing in mind how long it takes to train people to fly these jets. Because another point that Jens Stoltenberg is making is that Ukraine is getting through a vast amount of munitions. And I think one of the points he will say to these ministers is we need to step up industrial production. If Ukraine is going to get through thousands of bits of munitions so quickly on a daily basis, we need to be able to provide those. I think he will say that this will get less headlines than sending fighter jets, but actually on the ground is more important because he will look towards Russia. He says that the latest Russian offensive has already started. We're looking at Bakhmut, and it's quite clear that that offensive is being focused on that area. And he will brief ministers that Russia is sending thousands and thousands and thousands of troops and is prepared to accept high levels of casualties. That more munitions, more armaments, more support needs to go to Ukraine on the ground, as well as this consideration of jets. I'm sure they will also find time to talk about Chinese balloons that are floating over North America as well.
I'm sure it is surreal times. Adam, thanks so much. Let's get more on our top story now, and that's that Liverpool fans have been cleared after a review commissioned by UEFA found that both they and the French authorities are to blame for the chaotic scenes at last year's Champions League final in Paris. Well, I'm joined now by the sports journalist, Dan Austin, who is at the match as a Liverpool fan. Good to see you, Dan. Thanks for joining us. Tell us what you remember about that day and what happened to you.
Well, it was horrendous, to be honest. I attended as a fan, was stuck in really dangerous crushing outside the stadium for almost 3 hours before what was the supposed kick-off time. Women, children, disabled people were tear-gassed, hit with riot shields. People suffering really terrible anxiety attacks. It was not the kind of thing that anybody should ever be subjected to at a major sports or entertainment event.
Now, the French police were very heavy-handed that day. Tell us what it was like.
Well, yes, they treated Liverpool supporters the way they treat their own citizens on a day-to-day basis, really, i.e. Storming into masses of people with batons at the ready, tear gas, riot shields, in order to try and control people that they view inherently as animals as opposed to human beings. They had a flawed understanding of football in this country. They had a flawed understanding of things like the Hillsborough disaster, and went to that match with the idea that these were people who were automatically hooligans, who were there to cause trouble and there to be violent. It was absolutely not the case. Liverpool and pretty much all of the the top English clubs that play in Europe at this stage do not have modern histories of hooliganism or anything like that. This was a deeply flawed policing strategy, which is quite rightly in this report being called out for what it was, which was a significant part of the root cause of all of the carnage that occurred.
Now, this report does completely exonerate Liverpool fans. That must be somewhat of a relief after the initial response in France.
Well, it vindicates everybody who has put the effort in over the past 9 months it is at this stage in order to make sure that the truth is known. The authorities, various French government ministers, UEFA itself, all conducted a very targeted campaign from even before the match kicked off to try and blame supporters. They had the message on the big screen, UEFA, saying that the late arrival of fans was the cause of the delay to kick off. That was absolutely not the case. It was objectively untrue. The reporters found that. And what it also means is that this isn't just about this one event and Liverpool supporters. The reason that everybody wanted to speak up as much as they've done, and they've done so really successfully and should be proud of themselves because they've changed the narrative, is so that it doesn't happen again in the future, either at UEFA Champions League finals or their various other major events, whether that be Euros games or Europa League finals, whatever. That's what's important now. The report found that it was remarkable that nobody lost their life at UEFA's showpiece event. That's staggering and disgraceful. And if they don't implement serious changes and understand what they did wrong and how, then unfortunately nobody that attends their events is going to be safe in their care. That's what now has to be different, because next time it could be anybody else, any English team, any European team playing in a major event. At the moment, because UEFA does not actually take its responsibility to safety and security seriously, it does not actually oversee its own policies or take them seriously. That means that everybody who attends one of their events is currently unsafe, and that is completely and utterly unacceptable.
Now, Hillsborough, of course, it was a long time ago, 34 years ago nearly now, but it's still a very raw memory for the people of Liverpool. How much was this experience in Paris last year, how much did that add to the trauma for Liverpool fans in terms of the legacy of Hillsborough? And also, how much did it help that you already had experience and have talked about it to such an extent dealing with a situation like that?
Well, as I said, deeply flawed understanding of what happened to Hillsborough is partly the reason that it occurred at all. UEFA and the French police seem to have this idea that something from 33 years ago, where supporters were the victims of state negligence, essentially, was a valid way to kind of strategize policing for their events. That was disgraceful and downright offensive, really, in the first place. But the fact that Liverpool supporters have been through that and over 3 decades, first of all, meant that nobody died. People knew what to do. People knew how to look after one another. People knew how to behave. Even people like me who were not alive at the time of Hillsborough, you grow up in a post-Hillsborough world where your worldview is inherently shaped by it. The kind of social grief that you inherit is always there. So people have a kind of latent distrust of authority. People are willing to stand up for one another. That's just kind of built in. And that meant that people knew what to do during and afterwards. They knew to document everything that was happening. They knew to gather loads of audio-visual evidence and post it online. And they knew how to conduct a communications campaign that was significantly better than that of the authorities. What's actually happened in the past few months is Liverpool fans have had this report come through, one from Phil Scraton, one of the most respected academics in the country and beyond, and also one from the French Senate, all of which completely exonerate the fans. And it's because the way that people communicated on the night and since then, it was significantly better than the way that the authorities did. They tried to cover this up and were simply not competent enough to do so. The people that support Liverpool that went to that match on the night and that campaigned ever since have proven themselves more competent, more intelligent, more talented, downright, than those people who tried to blame them and who are in worryingly powerful positions in both governing European football and also wider French society.
Yeah, certainly. Hopefully this report will bring some comfort to them, Dan. We really appreciate your insight today. Dan Austin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks. Thank you.
Let's have a look at the weather now.
warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It'll stay dry and settled for most today, but it will turn wetter and windier tomorrow, I'm afraid. Britain will be mostly sunny but frosty for the first part of this morning, with some dense fog in places, mainly the southeast. The far west Ireland and Northern Ireland will be milder but largely overcast.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, it's Valentine's Day, so we asked for some people to find the top chat-up lines, which could make all the difference. And we went to the world's favourite artificial intelligence chatbot. So could his metal heart have the chance of winning your love this Valentine's Day? We even got a human judge and dating expert to see what she thought of its matchmaking potential. We'll hear some of ChatGPT's top chat-up lines. Do bear with me. Do you have a map? I keep getting lost in your eyes. Oh my goodness, I'm actually going to have to read these out. Dating coach Hayley Quinn says physical compliments are dodgy territories. She suggests complimenting them on an aspect of their personality. Probably quite good advice. Another gambit. If you were a vegetable, you'd be a cucumber. It goes on. Hayley doesn't mind this one, apparently. In the age of dating apps, funny first messages can go a long way. That's true, right? People like a bit of a laugh. The chatbot tries compliments too. Your smile is so warm and inviting. And Hayley say this is presumptive to the point of creepy. Well, I'm afraid we'll have more on that throughout the show, so apologies if you found any of that very creepy. But happy Valentine's Day. And coming up, we'll be speaking more about the situation in Turkey and Syria to UNICEF Child Protection Specialist Carmen Monclou about the challenges faced by children caught up in last week's earthquakes. Do stay with us for that. Welcome back to Sky News Breakfast, and let's get more reaction now to the ONS figures out this morning, which show that the number of days lost to strike action in 2022 was the highest since 1989. Well, Ali's here with more on this. And Ali, we've just had some reaction to these ONS figures from the Chancellor.
Yes, exactly. Reaction just in. So this is Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor. He says, in tough times, unemployment remaining close to record lows is an encouraging sign of resilience in our labour market. The best thing we can do is make sure people's wages go further, is to stick to the plan we have to halve inflation this year. So again, I think sort of what we would expect from the Chancellor, talking about the need to get down inflation first. That isn't going to stop people that say, hold on, there's pretty extraordinary that we're talking about so many strike days, more than any time since the 80s. Obviously, that's having an impact on the workforce, and there are plenty, including the British Chamber of Commerce, who say that the Chancellor needs to do something in the budget a month tomorrow to help with labour workforce shortages. That is one of the big keys to tackling some of the problems he's facing. But a response just in to those figures from the Chancellor.
Thanks for that, Ali. And certainly Jeremy Hunt may say he wants to get costs down for people, but one cost that looks set to rise for almost everyone is council tax.
Yeah, that's right. So these are figures that effectively suggest that, and we know this is something that Jeremy Hunt made possible in the autumn statement, councils can now raise council tax by 5%. It's easier to do without a local vote. That was something that was made possible in the autumn statement, and we're seeing councils doing that. According to this new research from County Councils Network, 3/4 of councils plan a 5% tax rise. That is about £99 a year if you're living in a Band D home. So that's a home costing between £68,000 and £88,000. We're saying 3 councils, Croydon, Thurrock and Slough, also have special dispensation to go even further with tax rises. Obviously, we know that councils say that they've been struggling. That's why they need to raise council tax, because of inflation, because more people are coming to them asking for support. But obviously, this is knocking that on to people struggling to pay their bills. The government have released a statement. They talk about the £60 billion funding settlement, a 9% increase on the year before they say councils need to ease pressure on people, but obviously this is not good for people paying their bills. Help for energy bills is also going to go down a bit at the end of March as well. And again, another pressure on the Chancellor ahead of the budget.
Yeah, certainly pressure on the Chancellor and a lot of pressure on so many households. Ali, thanks so much. Let's return to the situation in Turkey and Syria now. The death toll, has surpassed 35,000 people. And millions who have survived have been left homeless, sleeping in cars and tents in freezing conditions. Well, many of those affected are children. And for more on this, I'm joined now by child protection specialist with UNICEF, Carmen Monclou. Very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us. Now, I understand you've been working on UNICEF's response in northwest Syria. What are the main issues facing children there?
Yes, good morning to all of you. Well, as you have seen, the impact of the earthquake had been disproportionately affected children. We do have now a situation where we're moving towards recovery slowly after the rescue efforts. We have about approximately what we think is an estimate for now is 1.8 million children in need of humanitarian assistance, and this is quite an immediate figure. Among them, we find a lot of unaccompanied and separated children, as it is very normal after a natural disaster of this dimension. So all efforts are being made for doing the family tracing and reunification on one hand, while at the same time keeping these children safe and increasing our safeguards. Particularly now, it's very important these children are granted the protection and the care that they need. We do have a family tracing and reunification mechanism. The teams are working around the clock for as much as it's humanly possible at the moment. We are also providing psychosocial support and mental health to the children and their parents and caregivers. Slowly, our teams are coming active. We might recognize that a lot of the people affected population have been the agency themselves also on the ground, the agencies who are actually delivering those services. So at a time where we have so many needs and we see how exponentially it has impacted children, it's when we have less muscle than before. We already departed from a very low baseline. As you know, we had an armed conflict ongoing in the region, and therefore there was already an emergency response. So now all efforts are being made to reactivate it, to renew, to make all the mobile teams that we had active and multiplicate those when it's possible, particularly in the most affected areas.
Are children in danger in Syria following this earthquake?
Indeed, they are in danger. They are in danger. They face multiple risks, and all efforts are being made to mitigate those and prevent those. We can talk about physical danger, of course. I mean, we're talking about a high level of destruction. This hasn't been yet control. It's still under the recovery reconstruction phase, and it will be so for quite some time. We're also talking about multiple effects on their psychosocial, on their development, on their physical and emotional safety. And this is something that we're working towards that. We already had quite specialized teams on the ground before. This was a very solid operation with all the limitations that we had, but it is essential now that we continue and revitalize those structures that we had to the highest speed possible.
Carmen, just very briefly before I let you go, it must be absolutely heartbreaking to see these children going through so much, especially after 12 years of war. What is happening to children who've been orphaned or separated from their parents?
Well, as I said initially, we do have a family tracing and reunification mechanism, which is it's being managed from this house, from the UNICEF house here in cross-border in Gaziantep. All children that are found separated or there are indications that are separated must be registered. This is essential. This is the very initial step. Very important that every child is registered in those circumstances. An initial assessment is made. It's an individual assessment. Every child is different, and opportunities and challenges may vary from one child to the other. And therefore, a response to that child will be tailored to that. The best interest of the child are an absolute priority in each of those cases. There won't be a solution that suits them all. It's rather a very intense labor type of work that the teams are doing, trying to identify what's the best solution for every individual child. Many of those children may appear initially separated, but then it's found out they're not. So it's all this kind of work, which requires a lot of accuracy, a lot of rigor, is what is required at the moment.
Okay, Carmen Monclou, we're going to have to leave it there. Carmen Monclou from UNICEF, we appreciate you taking time while you're doing so much important work. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and have a good morning. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you. Now, as we've been reporting, the United States has accused Beijing of running a high-altitude balloon programme. And to talk more about this with me is former British Army Intelligence and Security Officer Philip Ingram. A very good morning to you, Philip. Good to see you. It's been an extraordinary set of events that's taken place in the last couple of weeks over US and Canadian airspace. How concerned do we need to be about Chinese surveillance?
Well, surveillance, state-to-state surveillance is nothing new. It's the second oldest profession and is going on a daily basis. This is just another technique that the Americans have retuned their sensors to be able to identify and find. And we've only had one balloon that's been identified as a Chinese spy balloon. The others are all anomalies and objects that the Americans haven't defined what they are yet.
Now, the White House said that, China's been using these balloons across several continents, multiple countries. They've been seeing this sort of activity for years. So why are we only hearing so much detail about them now?
Well, I think they're seeing for years. I think they're looking back at some of their historical records. The issue that there's been is, from a technical perspective, most of the surveillance radars looking for threats are looking for things that are moving fast, that they're metal objects, that they've got set parameters. And those are what the radars and the other sensors are looking for. The balloons are operating where they're moving very slowly. They're changing heights. Some of them are operating very high indeed. They have a very, very small radar signature. And all the filters that there were in the surveillance systems were filtering these out. They didn't see them as a threat. So the Americans and others around the world weren't seeing them. Now that they've looked at the Chinese spy, they've put these parameters back into their filters, and they've suddenly gone, oh my goodness, we can see lots. And they've gone back historically and seen that there has been a bit of a program of these going across continental US. They're very weather dependent, and they're not as easy to control as people would think.
Now, of course, as you say, Philip, the US and China have been spying on each other for a very long time. This is nothing new. And the US tends to use surveillance aircraft, which, of course, do fly fairly close to China. Could we be at risk of escalation here if a surveillance aircraft were to be shot out of the sky by China? Is that something that could happen?
Well, the Chinese have already escorted US surveillance aircraft that they have said have gone into Chinese airspace and forced them to land. And there have been a number of incidents over the years. So it escalates diplomatically. The issue that there is with balloons is that they are physical devices flying in another country's airspace. And international law requires you to file a flight plan and to say where they are for safety reasons. And this is what didn't happen here. And that's why this is sort of blown up into a little bit of a diplomatic spat. It's a speed bump. It's no more than that. It's because international law hasn't been followed, and there's a theoretical threat to commercial airlines or military aircraft because a sovereign bit of airspace has been invaded by another country. And that's what's causing this. And the Americans are now, I think, slightly embarrassed that they've realized it's been going on for a while.
Yeah, it's certainly extraordinary but serious stuff. Philip Ingram, thanks so much for your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, I will be joined by the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce to discuss the latest employment figures. Do stay with us for that. That's coming up. Welcome back. Now, new figures out this morning from the Office for National Statistics show that although the unemployment rate remains pretty much the same, slightly more people are now in work, with part-time staff driving up the numbers. Let's get more on this with the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, Siobhan Haviland. Good to see you. Should that have said slightly more people are out of work than previous unemployment figures? And indeed, what do these figures tell you about the health of the UK economy generally this morning?
Yeah, so the numbers have improved slightly, but we still have 1.1 million open roles in this country, which means that businesses are still really struggling to find people, and that is impacting the growth of their businesses. So our businesses are telling us they still can't find enough people, they can't fulfil their order books, they can't keep their hotel running at capacity, and it's a real challenge.
And would you say that is the major issue that the UK economy is facing right now, is this shortfall in the workforce, that people just haven't returned to work after the pandemic?
It's absolutely the number one thing that our businesses are telling us. They're struggling with their energy bills too, but finding people is the number one thing. And that is not just people not returning after the pandemic, it is parents struggling with childcare. We want to see simpler, more affordable childcare. It is getting older people back into work, but it's also all round just shortages of people. So we are saying to the government, we'd like them to review their shortage occupation list so we can bring people into the economy in certain sectors at the right time.
And what would make a difference? What would help with this workforce shortfall that we're seeing in the country?
So I would say a couple of things. Spring budget is coming up, so we'd like to see the Chancellor do something on childcare, and that might be affordability of childcare, but also supply. It's important to retrain older people to get them back into work, and businesses need to have flexible shifts for that. But it's also a question of looking at how we can bring more labour into the market.
And just very briefly, how much have strikes impacted and exacerbated our economic pain?
It's another challenge for business. Business like clarity and certainty so they can invest. This just adds more stress into the system. So it's really important for everyone to get around the table and fix the problems.
Now, the IMF recently forecast that we would be the only leading economy to slide into recession this year. Do you agree with that? Do you see that happening?
It's going to be a challenging year. It is. We're still going to see labour shortages and challenges around energy bills. But I have the pleasure of travelling the country and meeting businesses all over our regions and nations, and they are resilient and they are can-do and they will find solutions, but it is going to be a tough year.
Tougher here than elsewhere?
It's going to be tougher for us, but it's tougher for everyone.
OK. Siobhan Haviland, it's been really good to see you and talk to you about this. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, stay with us here on Sky News Breakfast. We have more on the independent report on the trouble at last year's Champions League final in Paris. We'll be speaking to a Liverpool fan who was at the Stade de France that day, caught up in the chaos. He'd also been at Hillsborough as well, and we'll have his story coming up in the next hour. Stay with us.